Alrighty, CNT125. We are now working on our network design lab. So on D2L, I've gone to the network design lab section of the content page and opened up the do folder. Here is our network design lab direction page. We'll download a copy of that so we have it for reference. We have our network design packet tracer file. We'll download that so we have it handy to use. And there's one additional document that you're going to want to download and have handy. It's this helpful information file. I'm going to come back to that in the second podcast, but you'll want to download that so you have that for reference or ease of use. All right, so starting off, this first podcast, I'm going to kind of do an overview of what you're doing. The second podcast, I'm going to get into some specific details and reminders to help you out. Alrighty, so first thing we'll do, we want to take a look through our design lab, and we really do want to read through the whole thing so we understand what is being asked of us. But in this podcast, I'm going to kind of give you a highlight of the big pieces, and then we'll get into some specifics in the next podcast. All right, we're going to do a network design for a small company. If you think back to 120, you kind of did a network design for a small company. You did the map, and you picked out some equipment, but that's all the further you went. This design lab is almost taking that a step further. We're now going to pretend to implement a design like we would have done in 120. So this time around, we're going to come up with a solution, but then we're also going to implement it. We're going to at least implement that solution and get it working. So that's going to be the focus of this, a small network design for a small company and actually get it functioning and working for the customer. So the first part needs assessment. These are the things that the company has noted we need. You'll want to read through and highlight a couple of these items. I'm going to keep going for now. What we need to generate for this design lab. First thing is we will need a network map showing what our game plan is. Normally when I give you a lab, I already have the map already figured out. This time you're going to need to make a map to show me what you're figuring out, what you're going to do. So that can be done on diagrams.net or draw.io, right in your Google Drive. And you can, I'm going to scroll to the end. I do have a map down here for planning purposes. Once you get this planned out, you can duplicate this in draw.io or diagrams.net with your specific information, your IPs, your ports, your VLANs, that kind of thing. But this is kind of like a working map that you can scribble up and mark up until you get your game plan figured out. And then you will need to, in draw.io or diagrams.net, make me a network map showing what your plan is. That'll be the first thing you need to do. The second thing is, then we're actually going to take this packet tracer file that I have for you and implement that, actually configure the switch, configure the router, configure the devices in the network to make this solution work for this site. That'll be the second part. And then when we're done, we'll save this packet tracer file along with your router and switch config, submit them as proof of this is working for this customer. That'll be the second part we do. Now, in here I have broken out the specific items you'll need to do, noting certain things are required and a couple things are bonus. Okay, that's what you're seeing as you work down through here, and a reminder that I need to make sure I have the packet tracer file plus the router switch config along with your map to submit to D2L, and that's what you're going to see down here. Router config gets submitted, switch config, your network map, and then your packet tracer file. If I see everything looks okay on these, I would not need to open the file, but the packet tracer file is going to allow me to open and do some pings and traces and make sure everything is functioning as it should. Last page down here, or near last page, is your rough draft of your map. This can be used for planning purposes, sketch out your ideas, get things figured out before you actually attempt to configure anything. And then the last couple of pages are, this is a copy of the rubric from D2L, so you know exactly how it's going to be graded. And you can almost use it check boxes to make sure you have all the pieces for your map, the pieces for your switch, the basic config on the router, the specific config on the router, and then last but not least, the functionality testing. And then down here is the breakdown of points. This is roughly 70 points. This is roughly the equivalent of like 2 labs, if you will. It's not super huge, but you're doing a lot more work than 1 lab. So we're We're making sure you get points for like 2 labs, if you will. All right, so there is a super quick overview. And again, when you open the packet tracer file, you'll see that there's the ISP side over here like we've had on many labs. You're not doing anything to this side of the network. This is just serving as a browsing and pinging site that you can go to. Your focus will be on this side over here, implementing your design on this router, this switch, and getting these devices working in this network for this customer. So your focus is be on this side of the network. Okay, so now let's go back and look at a few more details this time through to pull out a couple more key things that we need. All right, so what does this facility need? Okay, I know we're only showing 2 workstations here and 2 phones, but they're telling us that we are going to have at least 15 computers, and eventually they're planning of growing. So they're saying, hey, make sure you're allocating enough space for, 40 or 50 some computers, if you will. So initially we have a 24-port switch. That'll be adequate for to start with, but we want to make sure that we're leaving enough room IP-wise for the added devices down the road. We also note that these should be secured from other network traffic. Hint, hint, wink, wink, VLANs. We see in here these stations should basically get all of their IP configuration from DHCP. So our router would need to be handing out DHCP for these PCs. The second area, IP phones. Again, need to be secured. Hint, hint, VLANs. We're going to have about 15 devices to start with, eventually growing to like 45 or 50 devices. So again, we have enough ports now on our switch to accommodate the 15, but we want to make sure that our subnet for these guys is large enough to accommodate 45, 50 phones down the road. And we should have, they should be able to get IP, subnet mask, default gateway, all that good stuff from the router, your IP phones. Wireless, we have a simple access point here. We're doing just a simple access point for this design lab. We'll get to some details of that later. But we need to make sure that we have coverage in lobby and that sort of thing. Okay, so we'll have at least 1 access point. We want to make sure there's maybe room on the switch for a second access point down the road. Should be secured. VLANs. Should be space for about 15 or so visitors. So again, making sure there's enough of a subnet for them. Stations should receive IP subnet mask default gateway, DNS, via DHCP. So again, another DHCP scope for your wireless users. Last but not least, it says stations should be limited to this type of traffic. So when we hear traffic should be limited to, we're thinking access list. There will need to be an access list for the wireless users to limit their traffic to only these protocols. That's what I should be hearing there when I see that. Next area, they give us a heads up on what the ISP is going to give us. Well, the ISP is over here, and this is actually configured to hand out a 172.32 address to this router. So it's actually going to hand you an IP address from the 172.32 network. Now, we're saying that so that you are sure to avoid using 172.32 on your IP scheme inside here. You don't want to use a 172.32 in here and also get handed a 172.32. So make sure you are not using that inside your network. You have other options you can use. So that might be time to do a little bit of homework on what your other options to use inside your network. But we're sharing that so you know what the ISP is going to be giving you. All right, so there is some background information that you'll need for building the configuration for this site. Refer back to this, highlight, circle, take notes, etc. on these pieces of information. The first thing you want to do after doing this is get your map together. Get your map, get your game plan figured out. So again, I would start down here, maybe even print this page out and get some scribbles down on pencil or paper, or pencil. I would not do pen. Do some pencil. Get your IPs and things figured out. Make sure you have a good game plan before you even attempt to try to configure anything. And you might want to even take this and convert it into draw.io or diagrams.net and get your game plan figured out before you start configuring anything here. The people that barge right into this tend to get so far, hit a brick wall, and they're like, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. So I would get your map and game plan figured out first before you even tackle this. That's why I have this as part 1. When you're done, save that diagram because you are going to submit that to D2L. And if by chance you make your map and you start configuring your network and you make changes, not a big deal. Go back and change your map and make sure you're submitting that final version of the map when you submit your design lab. Okay, so it's not uncommon to have changes as you go. You learn something, and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to change that. Just go back and change your map. But get a good plan figured out before you even tackle configuring anything. All right, second part then is actually the network design implementation. So then you'll download your packet tracer file, open it up, and you're going to implement your design. Start by cabling up. And I even put a reminder here, make sure you're not going to power your phones yet. I would wait till later to do that. You'll connect into the switch and you're going to configure these parameters on. Give it an admin VLAN 1 IP, give remote access to your switch, enable password, console password, all those things. Make sure you create the necessary VLANs and associate the necessary ports. And then make sure you also configure your trunk and then save your config. That's really all you're doing on your switch. Pretty much a review of your lab midterm with maybe just a couple pieces added. Second part, you're then going to move into the router. Router, give it a name, configure the remote access, enable password, console password on your router, following those parameters. You'll then need to move into configuring the outside and inside interfaces. Your outside interface here, you're going to pick up an IP from the ISP. So that can be your dynamic port out there. Inside interface, well, you'll need some interfaces for all your VLANs. Whatever VLANs you're going to use. Admin VLAN 1, and then your other VLANs you're going to use for the PCs, for the phones, for the wireless. However you want to do that, make sure you create those and associate the necessary ports. You'll then need DHCP scopes for each of those VLANs, each of those sub-interfaces. You'll then need NAT for each of those groups for the desktop users, for the IP phone network so they could eventually make phone calls out, and for your wireless users so they could get over to the ISP. So you'll need to make sure you have NAT for each of those groups. We'll need to make sure we configure the phones. We need to at least give the phones basic config so that they can call each other. So reference back to the IP phone lab so that they get configuration so they have phone numbers 8001, 8002 so they can make calls to each other. You will then need to configure an access list for the Wi-Fi users. So you're thinking back to your security lab, firewall security lab, and writing an access list for just the Wi-Fi wireless subnet so that they only have HTTP, HTTPS, DNS, and DHCP traffic and nothing else. So limiting just that traffic. Now, there's a note I'm going to share a little bit later on the best way to tackle doing this. But that's the required access list. That should be on there no matter what. But you do want to make sure you do that last, and that'll be the reminder I tell you later. I also have a bonus access list that you can put in for the IP phone users, for the IP phone subnet, allowing only this traffic here. And again, on my info page, I have some info to help you with that. That'll be the basic router, or I should say that's the router config you're going to end up doing. Those are the pieces you're going to end up doing. I'm going to come back in the next podcast and continue on with what we need to do to get this configured and working.